Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Regina Garcia Cuellar. She joins us from Mexico, and she most recently led transformational efforts as Chief Commercial Strategy Officer at Izzy. That's the second largest telecom in Mexico. She's had a lot of experience as head of customer experience, and she's been active on several boards. And in her spare time, she managed to achieve a PhD in economics. So, Regina, we are super excited to have you. Thank you again for joining us today.
I'm so happy to be here. I love the theme of the podcast, so I'm very excited to be here joining you and your audience.
Thank you. I appreciate that. One of the things I was so intrigued about when I first met you is your experience in developing markets. It's not something we talk about enough in the US, even in companies with a global presence. From your perspective, what are some of the top challenges and opportunities working in a developing market?
The development markets are very similar to what you would find in developed ones, except that you have some sectors which are not as progressive or as competitive. And once you see sectors that are not as competitive, then you can have non-optimal results. For example, if you would go to telecom, in a competitive environment, you would have prices and companies competing for customers. If you are in a developing economy where you have a controller of the market, then prices tend not to go lower and customers do not have very good experiences.
As Americans, we can be a little America-centric. We forget about different political systems, different terms for presidents, for prime ministers, governments where they don't have democracy. Are there differences when it comes to balancing short and long-term goals? Do you see differences between how that's approached in a developing market?
It comes right to the point, your point about the short term and the long term. If you have companies in developing economies, many of the companies are privately held, or even if they're public, they're family owned and they have a family majority business. And that changes the whole spectrum of incentives and the way they look at short term and long term, because they don't have a market to respond to. They respond to their shareholders, which is the family. So that changes a lot in the way a company behaves. And also, if they're not working in a competitive environment, they're probably looking more into short-term gains rather than a long-term view where you have to respond to the market, where you have to respond to shareholders, where you have other checks and balances in the firms. And here, if you're a family-owned business in a sector where there is not that much competition, then you will have different incentives and different views of what the company is looking for in terms of their short-term and long-term view.
How do you think about the differences then when it comes to public versus private sector? One of the things we see in countries around the world, which seems to be happening more in the US, is extreme changes in point of view of the government. The policies of one administration are not necessarily carried through. They may be completely reversed or something totally different. How do you think about that?
The terms are much more dramatic. Particularly in Mexico, we have a 6-year presidential term and they don't have any re-election. It's a problem because when you're looking just for a 6-year term, you have no view on a long term. Basically, your view is on a 6-year term. And since you have no re-election, then it's even more problematic because you do not respond to the public in a long-term view. You basically are maximizing your 6-year term. And that, I think, makes incentives much more difficult than if you were looking to maximize the economy and to maximize the welfare of a country in a longer period.
That's super interesting. When it comes to Mexico specifically, how easy or hard is it to work in Mexico?
It's harder than what you would find in the US. It's harder because many of the firms are not institutionalized. And then you have governments which change it every 6 years. And you have very politicized governments, which not all the time want to work with the private sector. So I think it's harder to have a long-term view where you have governments which have a short-term view. And then that's where the incentives are not aligned. For example, if you're a real estate developer. You want to build something for the longer term, but the local government wants to maximize either their revenue or their view in this short term. So that does not align well with what you would have in a developed country where you would have institutionalized governments and institutionalized contracts where they allow you to go to the long term.
Are there specific sectors or industries then that are better suited to that 6-year window that you're referencing?
Sectors that are more competitive are much better viewed because the competitive forces of the companies allow them to grow more. For example, the finance sector in Mexico is very well developed and you have a lot of competition, and that competition makes companies look more into the long term. No, than if you have a sector that is not very competitive. For example, real estate would be one where you don't have that much competition because you own basically a part of land and you want to develop it, and then you have to depend much more on the government. In sectors where you depend much more on the government, it's harder to do business than in sectors as a finance one, where the competitive forces of the sector in itself allow you to grow and to be more competitive and to be more geared towards the long term and the good revenues.
Super interesting. What about when it comes to topics like nearshoring? Obviously, Mexico is a long and very important trading partner for the US. Nearshoring has been in the news quite a bit recently. How do you think about that? What are some of the opportunities and challenges for firms?
You talk about a very important topic for Mexico. Nearshoring is a great opportunity for Mexico. And here, the interesting regional differences are what make nearshoring more important in some regions of the country than in others, particularly in the north part of the country. Of course, we have much more infrastructure and we're much more connected to the US. So most of the nearshoring investments are going to the northern part of the country where everything is situated so that the companies will be competitive and able to send their experts to the US. You will have higher human capital. You will have much more infrastructure. You will have energy. You will have very good communication. You will have very good highways. And that has made the northern part of the country to develop much more quicker than the southern part. We don't have that much infrastructure. It's not connected to the US through highways. There is not a very good energy supply. And human capital, because of that, I think it's all connected. No, it's the chicken or the egg, but human capital has been slower in becoming much more educated and skilled, and with skills that will work in US plants than in the northern part. So that is making the economy develop at a very different rate in the northern part of the country than in the southern part of the country.
As you alluded, nearshoring used to really be discussed in US media in particular from, again, a very US firm-centric position, understandably. It was often portrayed as American companies looking to situate or expand facilities, as you mentioned, in the north of Mexico. One of the issues that seems to be in the news a little bit more is the idea of other countries using Mexico, including China and others who have now expressed an interest in maybe complicating the global trading landscape quite a bit. Do you have any thoughts about that additional dynamic in this question?
I think we're seeing, if you would divide the investment that is coming because of nearshoring, most of it is American companies, but also I think companies, and not necessarily China, but of course we have other Asian economies which are investing in Mexico because it makes a lot of sense. If your market is the US, to be situated in the northern part of Mexico where you will have very good infrastructure, very good human capital, and we will be near to your market, which is the US. So I think it makes a lot of sense politically to have companies investing in Mexico if their target market is the US.
Switching gears a little bit, across your career, I mean, you have done a really amazing job navigating some very complicated challenges. I wanted to know if you could take us through a few examples of what some of the challenges and opportunities are in a developing market.
For example, one of my most interesting parts of my career was working in Pemex, in the national oil company. Pemex historically had been close to private investment. But basically, this comes from a long time ago where the Mexican president nationalized oil, and oil became an important political stigma in the Mexican economy. It was always for the Mexican nationals, and it was a sector that could not be touched by the private sector. But of course, it makes a lot of sense to have co-investments between private and public in order to develop a sector. In 2013, a reform was passed where it allowed private companies to develop and to be able to exploit national oils jointly with Pemex and on their own. When I came into Pemex in 2016, I was part of the team that was in charge of implementing this new reform. And it was one of the most amazing transformation and being witness really of what a reform could do to a sector and to a company. It was a great experience for me.
How did you and your colleagues really come up with a strategy that kind of broke through that logjam?
It was amazing. And it was basically with this idea of not inventing what we call in Mexico, not inventing the black thread, no? It's looking at what other countries did when they do investments jointly, private sector with a public company. How do they do their joint operation agreements? How do they do the finance? What is the fiscal regime they have to have? So learning a lot from experiences of other countries and implementing, and of course you have to tropicalize it to be able to do it in Mexico. But it was learning from other countries and then applying it to Mexico. In this job, you have to align many interests. That was part of where my focus was, aligning the interests of the engineers and aligning the finances, aligning the fiscal regime, putting together everybody in order to achieve the same goal. In my team, we achieved the first farm outs that Pemex did with other countries. We did the first farm out in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico, then the farm inland, and then in short water. So it was very interesting. And I think these brought a lot of investment to Pemex. And what I think is very interesting is that it also brought a lot of experience from companies that were experts in deep water exploitation, bring their expertise plus their capital to help Pemex develop their fields.
Did you have the same 6-year constraint, or was that a project that actually spanned multiple administrations?
We tried to look at Pemex, and I think these contracts help because since you are making a contract with a private entity, then your view is lengthened automatically because you are doing a contract with a company, and that contract will last for 20 years, say. No, so all the incentives of the public company have to align to what the private company is doing, and then exactly is where the public company starts to work with a long-term view. I thought this is one of the best ways to make the government work as a private company.
It also sounds like there were some interesting partnerships that you developed and supported. Have any of those carried through for Pemex? I know you're no longer there, but has there been a long-term benefit to having those relationships?
I think it has. I think that Pemex has learned from these new farm outs. It has learned from new technologies. And the capital and the expertise that you saw when you were looking at Pemex engineers who were experts, of course, in Mexican fields with engineers who were experts in what they were doing, and the synergies where they were just amazing.
It's nice to know when the word synergy actually pays off, and there really were benefits as opposed to just corporate speak.
Exactly. It was actually a learning experience because Pemex engineers, they have worked in the Mexican oil fields for decades, and you put them to work with somebody who does not know the Mexican fields, but has a lot of knowledge on technology, on top-notch technical developments that helps create a lot of benefits to the country.
I imagine there's a lot of benefits to the stakeholders involved too, because to your point, they have complementary expertise to really partner well together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You also have done something similar in the private sector. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes, in the private sector, I've worked both in telecom and in banking. And in those two industries, also working on trying to put those view of the long term in what we're doing, and particularly in customer centricity and looking in the customer. They have to become much more customer centric. My work in both Citibanamex and in Izzy was trying to give these companies a long-term view in what will really drive the revenues in the long term and not just in the short term.
I know that you are really passionate about customer centricity. It's one of the things I really admire about your work. Can you tell us what it looked like pre and post that real focus on the customer, especially in regulated markets? American telecom companies sometimes don't have the best reputation for being customer centric, including some of the large banks too.
What's interesting for me is when I entered the bank, Citibanamex, they had what they called a cyclic bicycle. You have customers coming in and customers going out. And then you're not able to grow your base of customers in the long term because you have a lot of churn, a very high churn of customers they got sold a credit card and they never activated it because actually they never even wanted it. They didn't understand the product. They just went to a branch. Somebody sold them the credit card. And if they sell you a product that you don't want, you don't use it.
Right.
So in the end, the long-term benefits for the company are not good. You are acquiring a customer and you know that each customer has an acquisition cost. And you're not reaping the benefits because you're not getting to this long-term relationship with your customer. What Banamex did, and I think it was a very bold move, it changed all its incentives from sales to customer experience based to all employees all across the bank. So that was a very bold move, and I helped them do them. When they changed that, I became the head of customer experience. And part of my job was measuring, making sure that what we measure, because customer experience, you measure it through surveys. And you're using surveys to pay people. First of all, you have to make sure the actual survey measures correctly what you're doing, what you're going to pay to your employees. So that was one part. The other part was a cultural change in the bank. And I think that was very rewarding. It's a 40,000 employee bank. So trying to make sure that everybody understands why customer centricity is important and why in the long term, it will give you much more benefits than the short-term view of sales. Before the metric was sales, and that's a short-term view, and why becoming customer-centric, that will give you a long-term view and a long-term benefit because you build relationships. Now you want to become from a sales-based bank to an advisory bank, be like your trusted advisor of a customer. So that was very important part of my job. And then the third part was trying to help and navigate all the changes that the bank had to go through in order to actually deliver a better experience.
Really impressive. There is so much in that really resonates with me. One is I hear you talking about the importance of validating customer value. And I also love that you were able to realign the goals for sales around customer experience. Was that an idea that you all developed internally? Had you seen examples of that somewhere else and you thought that it might work in your business?
It was basically a novelty. I think that no bank had ever done that, but it did came from experiences that happened actually in the US, in Wells Fargo. We also had problems in Citibanamex with what we could call bad sales. No, if your incentives are just to create accounts or to sell cards, then you have bad sales, which sometimes they're fraudulent, sometimes not, but in the end, they will harm the company. It was basically based on that idea of turning from bad sales and from those bad incentives into the long-term view that the bank actually changed the whole incentives of the bank. And it actually worked.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. And to your point, this is exactly what Wells Fargo got into trouble for. So I'm glad to see that as they fix that solution has actually gone to other banks. I think that's actually pretty inspiring.
Yes, and I think that other countries are starting to regulate it because the sale incentives are very pervasive.
And powerful, yes.
And you have this cycle of improving sales, but in the long term, you're not reaping the benefits because you have to take into account what customers want and what customers need, because otherwise customers will vote with their feet and they will actually leave the company.
Yeah, Regina, this is such a great example. I could not agree more with your take and what you did. I'm so glad to hear that actually paid off. Because sometimes I think when we say customer centric, I sometimes hear some skepticism from folks who are like, oh, that's just, it feels fluffy to them. I think having tangible examples of where you could turn around a business by really orienting and anchoring to the customer need, just, it makes a lot of sense to me.
I think that customer experience became one of those buzzwords like ESG, like everybody was talking about it, but not really understanding
Yes.
the profoundness or the mere objective. Because you have to become customer centric, not just because it's something nice to do and
Yes.
because it's something nice to say, but
Mhm.
because you're actually looking at the interest of the long term in your company. You want to have loyal customers that are happy with your products and your services, and that you can have a very good relationship with them for the long term.
Regina, you had an incredible story about how you used customer experience to better motivate sales and to really drive business results. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I think it's a very good example on how aligning incentives towards the long run makes a lot of sense. Basically, when I started at the bank, one of the biggest problems that they had was that they had this static bicycle. Basically, you had customers coming in and customers going out, but the bank was not growing. We were not growing in number in clients. We were not growing in number of accounts. And one of the largest problems was that customers were getting products that they never wanted. They were getting a credit card, which was something that probably they didn't need. They didn't activate it and they left the bank. So we changed the incentives of the whole bank, and we changed from sales incentives to customer in experience based incentives, basically to NPS. And the idea behind all of this story is that you want to become the trusted advisor of your client and have a long-term relationship with your client instead of just pushing sales and acquiring customers. And basically, when you acquire a customer, it has a cost. So if you are acquiring customers but you don't have them long enough, then that relationship will not be profitable in the long run. Changing the whole culture of the bank towards customer centricity and basically towards customer experience was based on the idea that what you want to incentive is to become the trusted advisor of your customer, know the customer and understand what they need, and be able to provide the services that they need and make them have a better experience.
I absolutely love that. I think that is super inspiring. And I hope that's encouraging to anyone else out there who's thinking about how to appropriately motivate a team, but also really to do right by customers. So thank you for sharing that. In Mexico in particular, is there anything else that is very important to having a successful customer experience? Is it personal relationships or localized presence, or are there other factors like that?
I think it's interesting that we are not as developed as the US,
Hmm.
and we're still moving towards there. So before, you would say a customer relationship experience would be very personal. You would go to a bank or you would go to any of your shops and you would do everything personally, and you would have the branch manager that will know you. You have the older generation, which is still working that way, but you have a new generation or the young generation which want no contact with the bank whatsoever. Banks are in a very difficult position because on the one hand, you still have branches and you still want to give the service because you have a large portion of your population who still wants to go to the bank, who still feels secure going to a bank. But then you have a new growing generation that wants to do everything digital. You cannot go all digital if you want to attract, if you're a bank with 12 million clients. No, you have to have both. You have to have a very good service at the branches, but then you have to have a very good digital experience. So it's a challenge combining those two really well.
One commonality that really strikes me listening to you is that this experience that you have across telecom, financial services, and energy, all heavily regulated sectors, there are a lot of personalities to manage and a lot to navigate. How do you think about that when it comes to recommendations you might offer in those businesses and government regulators? How does that work?
You have to become very professional, be very cautious and very clean and very organized in what you're doing so that you can have an open conversation with the government, but have very organized a business so that you don't have problems. Of course, it's challenging, and regulators also want more information. And in the end, I think that if you have a very good organization, if you have very leaders who are working well and who understand the regulators, then you can do a very good business because regulation most of the times it's in the best interest of the people or of the customer. Regulators are trying to protect
Mhm.
customers.
Mhm.
They're trying to protect the interest of other people. Sometimes they make you work twice, or they make some requests which are very painful, but you have to do them. And if you are a business leader that understands that in order to have a successful business, you have to work well with regulators, I think you can work well.
Another topic that you are really passionate about is having diverse perspectives in the boardroom and in corporations generally. And I share that view. What do you see as the primary value of having broader perspectives, and why is it so important to you?
Having broader perspectives is important because we live in a in an economy and in a market which has women and has men and is diverse. You have very different sectors, and not just thinking about gender, but diversity in general. So you have to have leaderships that understand those that understand diversity in order to be better focused on the market that you're targeting and being much more able to serve your market well. You have to have those views in your company. So I'm a true believer that diversity is for the best of the organizations. It makes them better prepared. It makes them more open to different opinions. It takes them the blindness. Sometimes when you're the same people are working the same problem for a long time, they actually don't see the blind spots. So having a different perspective, having rotating leadership also gives you attunement on what the market is doing and being able to react quicker to be able to be more profitable and successful in the long term.
In Mexico or in other developing markets, is there a different perspective when it comes to having diverse experiences in the boardroom?
Definitely. We are very behind to developed countries. In Europe, for example, the percentage of board members who are women is around 40, from 40 to 50, no?
Yeah.
So they are in the upper part of diversity. The US is 30% women in boards. In Mexico, it's only 12.
Mm.
And of that 12%, only 3% are independent board members who are women. So we are very behind the diversity track. I'm in an organization, 50-50 women on boards, and we are trying and we are working to help boardrooms understand why diversity is important, why diversity is beneficial for them, and also try to see the women. We have an important talent of women who can become board members, but are not necessarily connected to those boardrooms. So making these connections and trying to promote diversity on the one hand, and on the other hand, making the connection so that women will be able to participate in these boards.
50-50 Women on Boards is a great organization. We had Heather Spilsbury on the podcast earlier, and just super impressed by her work and by your mission. So wishing you a lot of success in that. It's a long process, but it's nice to see that there have actually been some real successes along the way too. I was also amazed to hear the stats that you just shared about the numbers in Mexico. I mean, wow. I thought we had a lot of work to do in the US, but that's actually making the American numbers seem a little bit better.
Definitely, we have a long way to go, but there is a lot of focus on the numbers and on the statistics right now. We are progressing through 50-50 and through other organizations who are focused on the problem of diversity on boards. We're working really hard to improve the numbers. We'll be reporting the numbers by October, and I'm hopeful that we'll see an improvement. Just this year, I have many boards that I know that are starting to get women on their boards that didn't have before. Hopefully, we'll see a change this year in the numbers.
We appreciate hearing about your work here because I think it's another really inspiring point, I think, for folks that you're helping to take on that challenge, you and colleagues in Mexico. And we wish you a lot of success in growing that number and also delivering on business results, because that's what all the data shows. If we have more perspectives and experience on boards, the company does better. It's not just for the look of it. So
exactly. There are many reports that show that boards, companies that have diverse boards, they are much more profitable. They have higher innovation. They are more dynamic. So I think that in the end, it's for the best interest of the company to be able to have a diverse board and a diverse executive team as well.
I love it. Thank you so much.
But we're getting there. We're actually working on 4 fronts in Mexico. First of all, we're in education. We're jointly with the 50-50 Women on Boards in the US, we're giving workshops and we're giving mentorship opportunities for women in order to be able to become board members. Then we're working in advocating, talking to companies and making them understand why diversity is important and why having a diverse board will be beneficial for them. Thirdly, we're working on the numbers, trying to report, and we give recognition to companies that have more women on their boards. So we do an annual event and recognize companies who have more women on their boards. And finally, we work on networking because getting board opportunities, particularly in Mexico, has to do a lot with networking. It has to do a lot with you getting to know the people who are looking for the boards and how do you make those connections. So we are helping doing events, getting very talented women with board members and making those connections between board members and companies and talented women so that they can see the talent that it's out there.
I love that. It's very inspiring. We'll include a link to your work in the show notes too, so people can learn more if they want to.
Exactly.
Two questions for you as we wrap up. The first is, what is your top advice for CEOs and boards?
My top advice would be to be open to listen to different opinions, be open to see different views of the world, because I think that if you're open, then you will be able to react more quicker to what is happening in the market. I think in these dynamic markets and that we live in, you have to be very quick to respond, because if you're not quick enough, somebody else will do it. So in order to be quick, I think you have to be open and be able to listen. Be very open to listen.
What do you think that high performance companies do differently from average performers in your experience?
I think they depend a lot on data and a lot on analysis. And I think that you have to have a group of people, and I see these in large organizations. I don't see it in small organizations. And somehow small organizations think they can go without having high quality talent. And I think it comes to talent. It's amazing, but it's having a talent group which is working all the time on analyzing your data and analyzing other data in order to respond as well. And small companies think they can go about with not very good talent. And I think talent is crucial for high performing organizations. And the organizations that are going to be successful are the ones who have very good talent and who are always looking at analysis and data and the markets and trying to react quicker to what is coming from.
That is super helpful. Regina, thank you so much. This has been such a useful conversation. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. It has been very good for me to be here and very interesting to contrast what happens in Mexico versus other markets like the US.
It'll be really helpful for folks who don't have your level of expertise when it comes to Mexico. So thank you so much for sharing that perspective.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.